In a southern town where land means power and history runs deep, a 93-year-old black grandmother refuses to sell her farm to a white gang set on forcing her out. They see her as old, alone, easy to intimidate. But when they threaten her, she makes one call. What they don't know is her grandson isn't just family. He's a Navy SEAL commander with over 200 combat missions and a lifetime of ghosts buried in that soil. The threats would come, and when they did, they wouldn't just spark a defense, they'd ignite a war. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning mist clung low over the fields like a ghostly veil, drifting lazily between ancient oaks and rolling gently above the sprawling green rows Loretta Freeman had nurtured faithfully for over 70 years. At 93, she still rose before dawn, not because she had to, but because the land spoke most clearly in these silent moments when the world was still asleep. Loretta stood quietly on her porch, hands worn and calloused from decades of honest labor, eyes bright and steady as the first golden rays stretched slowly across her acres. This was not merely farmland. This was her family's legacy, her history, etched deep into every blade of grass, every stubborn weed, every sunlit patch of earth. Her family had claimed this ground shortly after emancipation, carving out freedom and dignity from the same soil that once bore their chains. Her parents had struggled, her grandparents before them too, weathering storms of prejudice and hostility that most would never comprehend. Every generation faced the same quiet threat, an unspoken resentment that clung to this county like mud to boots. Loretta carried this legacy proudly, her head held high even as her shoulders bore the invisible weight of history. In her small rural Louisiana town, racial tensions simmered quietly, hidden behind polite smiles, careful nods, and conversations that hushed too quickly when she entered a room. Loretta understood that beneath this quiet facade, bitterness lingered like smoke after a fire. The hatred here never completely vanished. It waited patiently, biding its time for another opportunity to ignite. Now, she felt that hatred creeping closer. She heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel long before the sleek black truck appeared, kicking up clouds of dust on the long dirt driveway connecting her farmhouse to the world beyond. Loretta knew that vehicle. It belonged to Wyatt Graves, a man accustomed to bending others to his will. He stepped from his truck with practiced arrogance, his rugged face set in a casual, confident expression, dark eyes sharp as knives. Wyatt was younger, strong-built, and moved like someone accustomed to getting his way. But Loretta had faced men like him before, men who assumed they held power simply because they spoke louder or pushed harder. "Mornin', Ms. Loretta," Wyatt drawled, touching the brim of a hat he wore more for appearance than practicality. "Another beautiful day out here on all this land of yours. Too much land for just one old lady, don't you think?" Loretta stood tall, her gaze unwavering. "Land ain't got age or gender, Wyatt. It's just land, family land. And it ain't yours." Wyatt chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "Well now, Ms. Loretta, we've been through this. You know plenty well you'd do better to sell. Lot of folks here think it's time this place belonged to people who'll make better use of it. Folks who fit better, if you get my meanin'." Loretta stepped down from the porch slowly, dignity guiding every step. "I know exactly your meanin', Wyatt Graves. You ain't the first to think you can bully me off this land, but I ain't movin'. Not today, not ever." Wyatt's pleasant facade slipped just slightly, a subtle hardness flickering behind his eyes. "You might reconsider that stance soon. It ain't safe to be so stubborn, especially at your age. You live way out here alone. People get hurt, Miss Loretta. Accidents happen. Then, without breaking eye contact, Wyatt turned and walked toward the old scarecrow that had stood in Loretta's fields for decades. With one sudden, violent motion, he yanked it from the ground, dragged it closer to the porch, and propped it up against her steps. Reaching into his coat, he pulled out a matchbook, struck one, and set the scarecrow ablaze. Flames hissed and crackled as dry straw erupted, smoke curling into the quiet air. He didn't speak. He just watched the fire burn for a moment, then looked back at Loretta with a slow, crooked smile. Loretta's jaw tightened. She didn't blink, but the fire danced in her eyes. "You threatening me, Wyatt?" He smiled coldly. "No threats, Ms. Loretta. Just being neighborly. Would hate to see something unfortunate happen. Out here, help ain't always close by." Loretta's voice dropped, firm but steady. "My family's been protecting this land since long before you were born. You think threats and your racist notions of who belongs where will scare me off? You're mistaken." Wyatt stepped closer, narrowing his eyes. "Careful with accusations, Ms. Loretta. Nobody mentioned race. I'm just saying, there's folks in this county who won't stand forever for your attitude. One day soon, your stubbornness is gonna cost you. Maybe cost you dearly." Loretta drew herself up, meeting his gaze fearlessly. "You go right ahead and do whatever it is you think you have to. But remember, this land's seen worse men than you try and fail." Wyatt hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face at her defiance. He backed away slowly, masking discomfort with a smirk. "Suit yourself, but remember, old lady, pride never stopped bullets or fire. Your time is running out, whether you accept it or not." Without another word, Wyatt turned and climbed back into his truck, leaving Loretta standing unmoved as dust rose in his wake. She waited until the vehicle disappeared down the long driveway, then exhaled slowly, hands trembling slightly. With anger she refused to show in front of him. Quietly, she reached for her phone, dialing a familiar number quickly. The line connected instantly. "Isaiah," she said, voice steady but carrying urgency. "I need you home. Things here are worse than I thought. Wyatt Graves and his people, they're not just talk anymore." Thousands of miles away, Commander Isaiah Freeman paused mid-action, instantly alert. "Grandma," he said calmly, his voice focused and strong. "I'll be there as fast as I can. Stay safe. No one's taken our home." Loretta pocketed the phone and gazed out across her land, illuminated now by full daylight, her heart filled with a quiet strength, knowing the challenges ahead might be fierce, even dangerous, but she would never yield an inch. She had fought and won before. This time would be no different. Commander Isaiah Freeman stood motionless inside a small, dilapidated building in a village whose name wouldn't appear on any map back home. Outside, explosions echoed distantly, flashes punctuating the pre-dawn darkness. Dust and smoke hung thick in the air, muffling distant shouts and the occasional burst of gunfire. Despite the chaos surrounding him, Isaiah's breathing remained steady, his mind sharply focused. Beside him crouched Dante "Doc" Harris, Isaiah's most trusted friend and teammate, eyes scanning the perimeter through the narrow crack of a boarded window. Doc glanced briefly toward Isaiah, reading instantly the subtle tension tightening his friend's jaw. "What's wrong, Commander?" Doc whispered softly, barely audible above the distant explosions. Isaiah hesitated, fingers briefly gripping the satellite phone that had just delivered Loretta's urgent call from home. "It's my grandma," he finally said, voice low, betraying nothing but controlled intensity. "Trouble at home. It's serious." Doc nodded solemnly, instantly understanding. "Say the word, and I'm with you." Isaiah gave a quick, decisive nod, and then pressed the comm at his ear. "Echo 1, this is Freeman. Extraction point confirmed. Mission accomplished. We're pulling out." "Copy, Freeman. Extract inbound." Hold your position." In minutes, their small extraction team swept silently through the shadows, Isaiah and Doc moving with fluid precision. They reached the rendezvous point swiftly, the helicopter descending through swirling dust and darkness, blades roaring above. Within hours, Isaiah was airborne again, flying westward toward home, his thoughts racing. Loretta's voice still echoed clearly, strong but filled with an urgency he'd rarely heard from her. Isaiah knew the toughness of the woman who raised him. If she was worried, it meant the threat was dangerously real. By late afternoon the following day, Isaiah stood firmly on familiar ground, staring up the winding driveway toward Loretta's farmhouse, now bathed in golden sunlight. Doc stood quietly beside him, eyes moving methodically across the landscape, scanning for threats out of instinct. "This place still peaceful as you remember?" Doc asked cautiously. Isaiah's eyes narrowed. "Peaceful was never the right word for this place, Doc. Looks quiet, but there's always been something boiling beneath." Doc grunted knowingly. "Understood. How serious we talkin'?" Before Isaiah could answer, the low rumble of an engine cut sharply through their conversation. A familiar black truck moved toward them down the long driveway, aggressively kicking up dust. Wyatt Graves pulled up sharply just yards from where they stood, stepping out and casually leaning against the hood, radiating arrogant confidence. "Well, well," Wyatt drawled, sizing them both up dismissively. "Looks like Ms. Loretta's called in some help. Y'all must be her city boys come to play heroes?" Isaiah held Wyatt's gaze, unwavering. "I'm Isaiah Freeman, Loretta's grandson. This here's my friend Doc. And you must be Wyatt Graves." Wyatt's expression tightened slightly. "She mentioned me, huh? Good. That'll make this easier. This ain't your business, friend. Best take your buddy here and go right back where you came from." Isaiah didn't blink. "My grandma called me home. That makes this my business. You want to explain why you've been harassing a 93-year-old woman?" Wyatt stepped forward, shoulders squared aggressively. "Careful, Freeman. Your grandma's mouth has already caused enough trouble. Folks around here got rules about respecting your betters." Doc laughed dryly, stepping slightly forward beside Isaiah. "Sounds like you might be the one confused about respect." Wyatt's eyes flared angrily. He motioned behind him, and two of his men stepped quickly from the truck. All three approached confidently, certain their numbers would intimidate the newcomers. "You city boys might think you're tough," Wyatt sneered, "but down here, we settle things differently. Maybe it's time someone taught you some manners." Wyatt lunged forward suddenly, throwing a punch aimed directly at Isaiah's jaw, fully expecting it to land. Isaiah smoothly sidestepped, countering swiftly with trained precision, his fist connecting sharply with Wyatt's ribs, sending him staggering backward in shock. Wyatt gasped, eyes wide with stunned confusion and rage. He rushed Isaiah again, swinging wildly. Isaiah dodged effortlessly, strategically blocking and landing precise strikes that visibly weakened Wyatt's resolve. Nearby, Doc faced the other two men, calmly stepping into their attacks, deflecting punches fluidly, his movements practiced and decisive. One thug tried grabbing Doc, but quickly found himself flipped hard onto his back, dust rising around him. The second man landed a solid hit against Doc's jaw, momentarily stunning him. But Doc quickly regained composure, retaliating swiftly, delivering a punishing blow to the man's stomach, dropping him to his knees. Wyatt, breathing heavily, faced Isaiah again, this time approaching warily, anger overshadowed by hesitation. Isaiah stood confidently, his stance steady. Wyatt's knuckles tightened as he squared up once more, the confident swagger now stripped from his face. Dust clung to his boots, and a fresh bruise swelled along his ribs where Isaiah had landed a clean strike moments before. The other two men were still struggling to regain their footing, but Wyatt wasn't ready to retreat. Not yet. He hadn't come here to lose a fight to a man he assumed was soft from city life, especially not a black man standing between him and what he believed was his. "You think you can come back here and play protector?" Wyatt spat, circling slowly. "You think you're better than us?" Isaiah didn't answer. He watched Wyatt's posture, the way his right shoulder dropped ever so slightly before each swing. That weakness was a signal. He was favoring his side now, likely cracked a rib. Isaiah waited. Let him burn his energy. Wyatt lunged again, more cautious this time, trying to feint left and catch Isaiah with a hook. But Isaiah read it easily, blocking low and stepping inside the punch to counter with an elbow straight to Wyatt's sternum. The blow forced a grunt from deep in Wyatt's chest. He staggered back, gasping for air. But before Isaiah could follow through, one of the thugs lunged in from the side, catching Isaiah with a heavy swing to the back of the neck. Isaiah dropped to one knee, vision flashing white for half a second. The hit heavier than expected. The man followed up, trying to tackle him fully. But Isaiah spun low, hooking his attacker's ankle and twisting sharply. The man hit the ground hard, landing awkwardly on his shoulder with a yell of pain. "Get up!" Wyatt roared to his men. "Put him down!" Doc, just steps away, was locked in a rough grapple with the other thug. Both men slick with sweat and dust. The thug landed a punch to Doc's ribs, making him wince, but Doc leaned into the pain, twisting the man's wrist until he screamed and dropped to his knees. Doc didn't hesitate. He drove a knee into the man's jaw, clean and fast, sending him collapsing into the dirt. But before Doc could exhale, Wyatt's first man, the one Isaiah had just tripped, scrambled up with a metal pipe ripped from the side of Wyatt's truck. He swung it blindly at Doc, grazing the side of his arm. The impact split skin, blood slicking Doc's sleeve. Doc turned sharply, eyes flaring. Not with panic, but with precision. He pivoted, stepped inside the next swing, and drove his fist into the man's throat with practiced control. The thug dropped the pipe, choking, stumbling back with wide, gasping eyes. Isaiah was back on his feet now, facing Wyatt again. This time, Wyatt had drawn a folding knife, the blade glinting in the sun as it snapped open. "I told you," Wyatt growled, chest heaving. "I ain't playing." Isaiah's stance shifted, hands lowered, his tone colder than before. "Then stop talking." Wyatt came at him in a flash, slashing low, fast and dirty. But Isaiah had seen it before. Dozens of times in tighter corners, worse places, under fire. He pivoted, catching Wyatt's wrist mid-swing, redirecting the momentum, then driving his own elbow into Wyatt's face. The sound of bone hitting bone cracked through the air. Wyatt dropped the knife, blood streaming from his nose. Isaiah didn't stop. He grabbed Wyatt by the front of his shirt, spun him, and slammed him hard against the hood of his own truck. "You brought this on yourself," Isaiah said, through gritted teeth, pinning Wyatt's face to the metal. "You walk into a fight not knowing who you're dealing with. And now you found out." Behind him, Doc stood over the two other men, breathing heavily. Both were down, groaning, bleeding, their aggression beaten out of them with clinical precision. Isaiah released Wyatt, who collapsed against the truck, barely standing. Blood smeared his shirt and forehead, his breath ragged, his fight gone. "I don't want to see you near this land again," Isaiah said, calm but cutting. "No more visits, no more messages. You show your face here again, and next time it won't be your nose that breaks." Wyatt wiped blood from his face, hatred burning behind his dazed eyes. "You don't know who you're messing with." Isaiah stepped forward, close enough that Wyatt flinched. "No, you didn't, but now you do." Wyatt stumbled into the driver's seat, shaking, his pride shattered. His men dragged themselves up, clutching their injuries, and piled in silently. The truck peeled out moments later, fishtailing in the dirt as it disappeared down the road. Doc glanced over at Isaiah, his shirt ripped and arm bleeding. "I thought we were just coming to visit your grandma." Isaiah didn't smile. He stared after the fleeing truck, jaw tight. "This wasn't a visit. This is a war." He turned, walking back toward the porch where Loretta stood silently in the doorway, her eyes full of pride and pain. "We're gonna need to prepare," Isaiah said as he passed her, voice steady. Loretta nodded once, her voice low. "We already are." The next morning broke with no sound but the rustle of cypress trees and the low creak of Loretta's old screen door swinging open. Isaiah stood near the edge of the porch, eyes scanning the horizon, posture still and tight. Behind him, Doc finished wiping down the gash on his arm from yesterday's pipe hit, tying a clean bandage tight with practiced ease. "Anything?" Doc asked, stepping beside him. Isaiah shook his head. "Quiet. Too quiet. Graves isn't the type to sulk." Doc glanced toward the barn, where Loretta had been tending to the livestock like nothing had happened. "She's strong." Isaiah nodded. "She always has been, but this isn't just about her anymore. He's gonna come back. And not just with fists this time." Later that afternoon, Isaiah and Doc drove into town to survey the situation and gather supplies. Whispers followed them wherever they went. Some curious, some hostile. At the general store, eyes lingered a little too long. At the feed shop, conversation quieted when they walked in. But not everyone looked away. Sheriff Hank Grayson caught up to them as they were leaving the hardware store, stepping out from his cruiser parked beneath the shade of an old pecan tree. "Commander Freeman," he said, removing his hat and wiping his brow. "Doc," Isaiah nodded slowly. "Sheriff." Grayson glanced around the quiet street, then leaned in slightly. "You stirred up a hornet's nest, son. Word is Graves limped into the clinic last night swearing he got jumped by outsiders." Doc smirked. "Outsider's a funny word for a man defending his grandmother." Grayson gave a dry chuckle, but his eyes stayed sharp. "You boys didn't just knock around a gang leader. You disrupted an arrangement." Isaiah's brow furrowed. "Arrangement?" Grayson looked down the street again before speaking lower. "I've been holding my tongue for too long. Graves isn't just some loud-mouthed bully. He's a broker. He launders land for bigger players, moves money, buries threats. Cartels got stakes in this town, and they use him to keep things quiet." Isaiah folded his arms. "You're just now saying this?" "I've had my hands tied for years," Grayson admitted. "Too many state officials lean on me to look the other way. Every time I tried to push, something happened. A deputy reassigned, a fire downtown, a witness disappearing. But if you're really staying, really fighting, I'll feed you what I know." Isaiah glanced at Doc, then back at Grayson. "We're staying. And we don't need badges to deal with corruption." Grayson looked over his shoulder again, then pulled a folded map from his pocket. "Graves's cousin owns a property on the edge of town. Used to be a sugarcane plant. Now it's a storage depot. But it ain't sugar they're moving through there anymore. I've seen trucks coming and going at midnight, marked with fake company names. I couldn't get close, but you might." Isaiah took the map, tucking it into his vest. "Good. Let them think we're just guarding a farm." Back on Freeman land, Isaiah and Doc spent the evening reinforcing the property. They mapped out key sight lines, marked blind spots around the barn, and laid sensor-triggered trip alarms across the fence line. Isaiah buried low-profile camera units facing each approach road, connecting them all to a makeshift hub in the tool shed. Doc nodded as they checked the feed. "You're turning this place into a forward operating base." Isaiah's voice was flat. "Better to be ready and not need it." They trained some of the younger locals, too. Quiet farm hands, mechanics, a few former veterans, men and women who'd grown tired of being afraid. Isaiah taught them how to use basic surveillance, how to spot a tail, how to hold a position. Doc ran them through drills in the fields, silent movement, coordinated signaling, improvised defense. It was rough, but effective. For the first time in years, The town began to believe that they didn't have to take Graves's abuse lying down. And that's when the retaliation came. It started with burned crops on the edge of Loretta's land. Acres blackened overnight. Then came the dogs, her livestock poisoned. A shed was torn apart in the night. Fencing slashed. Messages were left, carved into her barn wall with crude hatred. But there were no bodies, no faces to blame. Just damage. Isaiah took one look at the wreckage and knew this wasn't just local trouble. These attacks were tactical, professional. Clean entries. No prints, no sound. This isn't Graves, he muttered. He doesn't have this kind of discipline. Doc crouched by the cut fencing. But someone wants us rattled. Isaiah went straight to the shed, where the surveillance feed backed up his suspicion. The grainy footage showed masked figures moving with military precision. The truck they used bore plates registered to a defunct construction firm out of Baton Rouge. A shell company, like Grayson warned. Doc examined the files they recovered from the shed's servers, connecting timestamps and movement logs. These aren't random vandals. This is an op, controlled, timed. Isaiah's eyes narrowed as the pieces clicked into place. This farm isn't just about land, it's about position, transport. It's a corridor for smuggling. He opened a local GIS map, cross-referencing elevation data and shipping routes. Loretta's property sat at a vital junction. Rivers, back roads, and access to distribution networks stretching across 3 counties. The farm was perfect cover for discreet logistics, and whoever had been using it before, they were furious about losing access. Isaiah's voice turned sharp. They're not just trying to scare us off. They're trying to erase evidence. He looked out at the fields, the same fields his grandfather had plowed by hand, that Loretta had fought to keep for decades. Now, they were the battleground for something far bigger. He turned to Doc. We're not dealing with a gang anymore. Doc nodded grimly. We're dealing with a network. Isaiah's jaw clenched as he stared toward the road where Wyatt Graves had disappeared. And we just declared war on it. The following morning, the town square was unusually busy. Folding chairs were set out on the courthouse lawn. Local vendors lined the walkways with lemonade, pies, and jars of pickled okra, and the buzz of conversation floated beneath the canopy of a cloudless sky. But Isaiah saw through it. Beneath the polite smiles and weekend charm, tension simmered. Too many glances shot in his direction. Too many half-finished greetings. The town was watching, and not all of them were friendly. At the center of it all stood Mayor Eli Landry, smooth-talking, silver-haired, smiling in a crisply pressed blazer like a man running for re-election. Isaiah watched from a distance, arms crossed, as Landry stepped to the podium set up beneath the old magnolia tree and tapped the mic lightly. Ladies and gentlemen, we stand here today united, not divided by recent tension. I've heard your concerns, and I want to reassure you, no one will be forced from their land. Especially not Ms. Loretta Freeman. A ripple of applause moved through the crowd. Loretta, seated near the front, gave nothing but a quiet stare. I've spoken with law enforcement and personally asked Wyatt Graves to stand down. I want peace in our community. I want respect for our elders, our traditions, and our future. And anyone threatening that peace will be dealt with swiftly and fairly. Doc leaned in toward Isaiah without shifting his gaze. He's greasing the wheels. Isaiah's voice barely moved. He's building cover. When Landry stepped off the podium, he made a deliberate pass by Loretta's row, offering a small smile and handshake. His eyes flicked briefly toward Isaiah. Briefly, but enough. It wasn't courtesy. It was a warning. Bodisi that night, under a moonless sky, Isaiah and Doc moved like shadows through the dense edge of pine and sugarcane just outside of Miller's Hollow, the old sugarcane plantation that Sheriff Grayson had warned them about. On paper, The property had been abandoned for over a decade, officially listed as an agricultural loss after a flood wiped out the fields. But according to Grayson, it hadn't stayed empty. Trucks came and went at odd hours, always unmarked, always careful. Isaiah set up a surveillance rig just beyond the tree line. Motion sensors and night vision cameras tucked into the brush. They waited in silence as crickets sang around them, and the occasional owl cut through the dark with a lonely cry. At 2:17 a.m., headlights crept up the dirt path. A black box truck, no logos, no plates, rolled smoothly through the old iron gate, which opened without a driver stepping out. Isaiah raised his camera and snapped clean stills. Doc watched through binoculars, recording timestamps. "They're not growing sugar anymore," Doc muttered. "No," Isaiah said. "They're moving weight. Crates, unmarked. Probably drugs, weapons, or both." Doc scanned the perimeter. "Think Landry knows?" Isaiah zoomed in on the truck's cab. "He doesn't just know, he's tied to it." By morning, Isaiah was walking into City Hall, calm but deliberate. He moved through the lobby with purpose, bypassing the receptionist with a short nod. Landry's office door was open. He stepped inside. Mayor Eli Landry was standing by the window, sipping from a white mug. "Commander Freeman," he said without turning. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Isaiah didn't stop moving. "Why was Wyatt Graves in your office 2 nights ago?" Landry turned slowly, his smile polished. "Wyatt's a concerned citizen. Passionate, maybe a little dramatic." Isaiah stood squarely across from him. "He's a cartel puppet, and you're pulling strings on both ends." Landry's smile didn't waver. "Now that's a dangerous accusation, son. I've stood by this town for over 20 years. From behind a desk while it rots," Isaiah snapped. "The sugarcane depot at Miller's Hollow. Your name's on the title through 3 different shell companies. We have trucks on video. We know the routes. You think you can pacify this town with handshakes and speeches while laundering for traffickers?" Landry set the mug down slowly. "You have no idea the forces you're playing with. You're just a soldier, Commander. You follow orders. You don't understand what keeps towns like this from collapsing." Isaiah leaned forward, voice low. "Towns like this don't collapse. They get gutted from the inside by men like you." Landry's smile thinned. "Be careful, Isaiah. Your name might carry weight in the military, but around here, you're just a man out of place. This isn't a battlefield. It's politics." Isaiah's gaze didn't move. "Then you're about to find out what happens when politics runs into a man trained for war." Back at the farm, Isaiah gathered Doc and Sheriff Grayson in the shed, the surveillance footage playing back on a dusty screen. They tracked every truck's movement, documented every face, every crate, every license plate. Grayson handed over a thumb drive with old tax records, shell company transfers, land grants, donations linked to cartel fronts, all tied back to Eli Landry. "He's not just turning a blind eye," Grayson muttered. "He's the one lighting the fuse." Doc scanned through the video logs. "They've got a window. Saturday night, Route 12, clear by Saturday. It's all over these texts." Isaiah nodded. "We set the trap." They spent the next 2 days prepping the land like a forward base. Trip wires, pressure alarms, flares rigged to motion sensors, and silent alert feeds synced through portable monitors. They leaked false intel through whisper networks that a back trail off Freeman land was unguarded, prime for moving product out before the feds caught on. Saturday night came quietly, too quietly. Then, like clockwork, 4 trucks, masked men, same unmarked vehicles. They breached the west fence line fast, like they'd done it before. Isaiah and Doc lay in wait inside the barn loft, scoped in, calm and still. Sheriff Grayson was hidden near the tree line, body cam live, a drone circling overhead. Then Graves stepped from the first truck, armed, confident, ready to finish what he started. Isaiah waited until every piece was in place. Then the floodlights roared to life, flooding the field in white-hot brilliance. The masked men froze. The trap snapped shut. Isaiah and Doc descended like ghosts. Tactical, brutal, clean. Within minutes, half of Graves's crew was down or restrained. The others scattered, only to be corralled by Grayson's team hiding in the dark. Isaiah took Graves down himself, pinning him in the dirt with a knee to the back and a fist gripping the collar of his shirt. "Who gave the order, Wyatt?" Graves groaned. "You're dead, Freeman. You don't know who you're messing with." Isaiah slammed him down again, dust rising from the impact. "Who gave the order?" Graves finally looked up, breath ragged. "Landry! Landry gave it all." Isaiah stood slowly, heart pounding but face unreadable. The lies, the parades, the speeches. It all led here. He turned to Doc, voice level. "This doesn't end with Graves." Doc's eyes were locked on the road, already thinking ahead. "It ends at the top." And back in town, in the polished wood halls of City Hall, behind the smiling eyes and practiced charm, Mayor Eli Landry had no idea the storm now headed straight for him. The sun cast long amber lines across the Freeman land, stretching through the fields like veins of fire as Sunday church let out, and folks slowly drifted toward the town square. Whispers carried across front porches and under shade trees. No one missed what had happened the night before. Floodlights blazing in the dark, gunfire echoing faintly through the woods, trucks speeding off down the back roads before dawn. But now, the story was spreading in full. Wyatt Graves had tried to storm Loretta Freeman's land, and he lost. Word traveled fast in a place like this, faster than truth could keep up. Some versions had Isaiah fighting off 10 men alone. Others said Sheriff Grayson showed up with a federal task force. But one thing became clear to everyone. Something had changed. Isaiah didn't hide from it. He stood before the congregation of First Baptist of Whitefield that same afternoon, not at the pulpit, not as a preacher, just in front of the steps, his voice calm and steady, hands open at his sides. "I didn't come back here to start a war," he said, meeting their eyes, "but I won't let anyone destroy what my family built. We've been quiet too long. We've looked the other way when Graves and men like him used fear to control this town. That ends now." He paused as the murmurs settled. Some people looked away. Others nodded, slow and deliberate. "They came onto my grandmother's land in the middle of the night with weapons. They weren't just threatening us. They were threatening you, your homes, your silence, your future. So I'm asking, not for permission, but for partnership. We're building defenses. We're organizing. And if you've had enough, we'll take this stand together." There was a stillness. Then a voice spoke up from the left side of the crowd. Harold Duncan, a wiry mechanic in oil-stained overalls. "I got 2 sons. Ain't gonna let 'em grow up scared of white trucks driving slow past our house. You tell me where to be." Then came Clara Bell, who ran the feed store. "I can get y'all supplies. Quiet. No paper trail." And then more. "A nod here," A whispered. "I'm in." What began as tension cracked open into something deeper. Resolve. That night, Isaiah, Doc, and Sheriff Grayson mapped out contingency plans in the barn. They split the land into defensive quadrants, trained the volunteers on how to watch without being seen, and set up signal systems using old lanterns and mirrors for communication at distance. They built more motion alarms and buried trip sensors across the western field line. The direction they expected retaliation, the retaliation came faster than expected. 2 nights later, just past 11 p.m., a low thrum rolled across the horizon. The sound of motorcycles, distant but approaching. Isaiah, standing at the edge of the porch, tapped twice on the side of the banister. Doc emerged from the tool shed. Grayson pulled up silently in his cruiser and cut the engine. "They're coming in fast," Doc said, scanning the field monitor. "4 bikes, 1 pickup trailing. Same old game. Intimidation? Lights off? No plates." Isaiah turned to Grayson. "Let them get close. We want them to commit." They waited behind cover as the gang crossed onto the Freeman land, headlights still off, dust kicking up behind them in the moonlight. The lead biker tossed a bottle of gasoline toward the chicken coop, sparks flickering from a lit rag. The flame didn't reach the ground. Isaiah moved first, fast and clean, intercepting the throw mid-air with a tackle that sent the man flying. Doc flanked the second rider, dismounting him with a brutal elbow to the ribs and a sweeping leg kick that dropped the bike and rider in one fluid motion. 2 others tried to circle, but Grayson stepped out from the shadows with a pump shotgun leveled clean and steady. "Put it down!" he growled, voice clear and sharp. "Now!" The men froze. One dropped his chain. The other tried to bolt, but a tripwire caught his ankle and sent him face first into the dirt. The pickup skidded to a stop 50 yards out. The driver reversed, tires spinning. But it was too late. Doc fired a warning shot into the air, and Grayson pulled the cruiser into the path, lights flashing red and blue. By the time it was over, 3 men were zip-tied in the grass. 2 others limped into the dark, leaving behind bikes and weapons. Isaiah stood over the wreckage, his voice steady as he spoke to the nearest man. Face bloodied, nose broken. "You're gonna tell Graves this land is watched, and if he sends anyone else, they won't walk off it." Grayson stepped beside him. "And tell your mayor it's official now. I'm filing charges." The man coughed, spitting blood. "Won't stick." Grayson bent low. "Maybe not before, but I ain't the same man I was yesterday." By morning, the story was all over town. Sheriff Grayson had helped stop an ambush. Graves's men had been arrested or run off. Isaiah Freeman hadn't backed down. People who once stayed silent began speaking up. A local builder offered fencing supplies. A teacher brought flashlights and batteries. Young men started arriving on the Freeman land with rolled sleeves and quiet nods, ready to dig posts or stand watch. Even the pastor sent over fresh bread and a message: "We're not afraid anymore." Doc looked out across the field as the sun broke through the tree line, watching the volunteers finish repairs from the night's damage. "It's starting to shift." Isaiah nodded, arms crossed. "Graves doesn't just have a fight now." He paused. "He's losing the town." The rain fell steady and cold the next morning, washing the red dust from the roads and filling the ditches that ran along the edge of Freeman land. Isaiah stood alone inside Loretta's old barn, the scent of wet wood and diesel heavy in the air. Doc worked quietly at a folding table nearby, piecing together encrypted files pulled from the burner phone one of Graves's men had dropped during the last ambush. Each click of the keyboard echoed like a distant drumbeat. They hadn't slept much. Isaiah's fingers hovered over a dusty crate in the corner, one that hadn't been opened in years. Its lid was sealed shut with leather straps and a rusted lock. Loretta had always kept it hidden. Last night, after patching up a broken fence post, she handed Isaiah the key with no words, just a long, knowing look. He hadn't opened it until now. The lid creaked open. Inside were old manila folders, brittle at the edges, and a faded photograph of his parents, Samuel and Patrice Freeman, smiling in front of the house, Loretta's younger face in the background, laughing. There were property records, too, handwritten notes in his father's blocky script. One page caught Isaiah's eye immediately. Disputed deed boundaries. C. Landry. He froze, reading the words again. He'd been no more than 10 when his parents died. Car accident was all anyone ever said. But that summer, he remembered whispers in the kitchen, hushed arguments late at night. And one night in particular, when his father came home bruised, face hard as stone, refusing to speak. He always assumed it was a robbery gone wrong, a tragic accident. But what if it wasn't? Doc's voice pulled him back. "I cracked it," he said, sliding a flash drive across the table. "Encrypted folder, buried in the phone. Took hours to decrypt." Isaiah plugged it into the laptop, the screen illuminating rows of coded emails and contract logs. Doc leaned over his shoulder. "Most of it's cartel logistics, shipping manifests, transport timelines. But look at the coordinates tied to these shipments." Isaiah clicked open the geotags. One after another, they pinged back to southern Louisiana, Loretta's farm marked in red. His throat tightened. "They weren't just using her land as a backdoor route," he murmured. "They were protecting it, planning around it. It's strategic infrastructure to them." Doc scrolled further, stopping on one email header. "From E. Landry to Delgado Group." He opened the thread. The body was brief but chilling. "Freeman land still contested. Pressure increasing. Recommend escalation before next quarter." Isaiah stared at the screen, heart pounding. Delgado Group was a known cartel shell used for laundering, cover operations, and political influence. Landry had been communicating directly. Escalation wasn't a reaction. It was a long-planned decision. Doc exhaled, jaw clenched. "Landry's in this deep, state-level deep." Isaiah backed away from the desk slowly, fists clenched at his sides. "They've been circling this land since before I was born." "Your parents," Doc said quietly. "What if they knew? What if that's why?" Isaiah didn't answer. He stood frozen, staring at the screen, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the rain outside. The files, the map, the emails, it was all connected. And now the questions he'd carried for decades were no longer just ghosts. They were pointing at something real. He turned slowly, walked away from the table, and crossed the barn toward the back door. His boots echoed heavy against the wooden floor. The rain was still falling, steadier now, soaking the ground, turning the fields into long strips of red mud. He stepped outside into the mist and followed the narrow path to the porch, where Loretta sat in her rocking chair, wrapped in a wool shawl, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the tree line. Isaiah stopped in front of her, water dripping from his jacket, his voice low and tight. "You knew." She didn't look up. "I found Dad's notes," he continued. "The deed dispute, the arguments with Landry, that photo from the crash site, and now this. Emails from Landry to Delgado, calling our land critical infrastructure, planning escalation. None of this was random." Loretta slowly turned her eyes toward him. They were steady, but behind them lay something deeper. Grief and something else just as sharp. "Resolve." "I asked you once," Isaiah said, voice trembling now, "about the night they died. You told me it was the rain. Said the road was slick. You let me believe that for 30 years. "I did," Loretta replied softly. "Because you were 10 years old, and already carrying more pain than any child should." Isaiah stepped closer, fists clenched at his sides. "Did Landry kill them?" Loretta exhaled through her nose. "Not with his hands, but yes, he's the reason they're gone." Silence filled the space between them like thunder that never struck. "He'd been circling the land for years," Loretta said. "Your father was kind. Thought he could reason with evil. He believed in process, in paperwork and town meetings. But when they started threatening your mama, he stopped playing polite. Told Landry face to face he'd never sell. 2 weeks later, the brakes gave out. I knew before the sheriff even showed up." Isaiah's jaw locked. "And the sheriff? The investigation?" "Buried," she said. "Just like them. The old sheriff was on Landry's payroll. Told me it was an accident. Said the roads were wet and folks make mistakes. But I saw the damage. I saw the dents on the back bumper. I saw your daddy's blood under his fingernails when they pulled him from that car." Isaiah sat down on the porch steps, rain soaking into his jeans. His breath was shallow, eyes locked on the gravel path leading out to the main road. I fought wars overseas thinking I left all the real enemies behind. But the ones who killed my family were right here the whole time. Loretta didn't respond. She didn't have to. After a long silence, Isaiah stood again. His voice was no longer trembling. It was grounded even. They killed my parents for this land, and now they're coming for it again. But this time, I'm here. Loretta's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something passed through her eyes. They thought we'd fold. That one generation would give up what the last one bled for. But they didn't count on you. Isaiah nodded slowly. I'm not just protecting what's ours. I'm going to expose every name, every lie, every dollar they moved through this place. Delgado, Landry, all of them. He turned and headed back toward the barn, the rain washing down his back. The pain of the past finally crystallized into purpose. As he stepped inside, Doc was still at the table, scanning through the files. You good? Doc asked without looking up. Isaiah's voice was firm. Not yet, but I know what needs to be done. Doc glanced over. Then let's do it. Isaiah moved to the map on the wall, tapped the cluster of red dots encircling the Freeman property. We take these files public. Grayson already suspects. We get the press, the feds, someone who isn't bought. We draw them out. Doc nodded. And if they push back? Isaiah stared at the pin over his home. Then we bury them, same as they tried to do to us. Outside, the rain began to slow, the clouds breaking just enough to let a pale sliver of light push through. It stretched out across the sodden fields, illuminating the soaked earth with a faint glow. For the first time, Isaiah didn't see the rain as weight. He saw it as cleansing. And what came next would be the storm they didn't see coming. Night fell thick over Freeman land like a heavy curtain, swallowing the last traces of pale dusk. The air had gone still, unnaturally quiet. No wind rustling the pines, no crickets singing in the brush. Even the livestock huddled close to the barn, uneasy, noses twitching at something they couldn't name. Isaiah sensed it too. He stood on the front porch beside Doc, eyes narrowed toward the woods. They're coming, he said quietly. Doc didn't ask how he knew. How many? Enough to make a statement, Isaiah replied. But not enough to win. Doc cracked his knuckles and checked the sidearm on his hip. Time to make 'em regret showing up. Moments later, the first shot rang out. A single crack from the tree line near the north fence. It wasn't aimed to kill, it was meant to scatter. Then came the roar of engines. 2 trucks burst through the lower field gate, lights off, barreling through rows of crops, crushing soil and stalks beneath thick tires. Isaiah moved fast, signaling with 2 sharp hand gestures. Floodlights surged on around the barn, casting stark shadows across the open yard, just as masked men began spilling out of the trucks. They came with bats, pipes, machetes, expecting fear, chaos. Instead, they got fire. Isaiah dropped the first 2 with clean shots from the upper loft, 1 to the leg, 1 through the shoulder. Doc moved like a ghost, flanking from the barn's west side, sweeping the legs out from one attacker before driving a boot into his chest and yanking the next to the ground by the collar. They fought without waste. No yelling, no panic. Every move was a lesson in precision, but the numbers kept coming. A Molotov flew from the second truck and shattered against the edge of the shed, fire licking up the wooden siding. Doc grabbed the emergency hose and doused it quickly, but the damage was done. The air filled with smoke and the metallic tang of burning oil. "They're trying to force us out!" Doc shouted over the crackle. "Corner us!" Isaiah checked the advancing figures in the tree line. "They want us to chase. Let's give them what they want." He and Doc dropped back from the open yard, retreating toward the swamp line behind the property, an area they had pre-mapped and booby-trapped days ago. They disappeared into the shadows just as Graves's men charged the porch. But no one was there. The woods welcomed Isaiah and Doc like old comrades. Dark, wet, unforgiving. They slipped through the cypress and knotted roots, moving in silence, heads low, bodies fluid. Motion sensors clipped to trees pinged softly in Isaiah's ear, marking movement behind them. "They're splitting into two teams," Doc whispered, "trying to flush us into the basin." Isaiah smirked. "Bad idea." They led the pursuers deeper, where footpaths turned to slick mud trails, and every step became a gamble. One man fell into a camouflage trench and cracked his leg with a sickening snap. Another triggered a noise trap, a burst of blanks that echoed through the woods, making them fire blindly in panic. Isaiah emerged from behind a rotting log, grabbed a man by the collar, and drove him face first into a tree trunk. Doc came down from the trees above, knife in hand, silently subduing another and dragging him into the underbrush before his teammates noticed he was gone. By the time Graves arrived, panting, red-faced, and armed, half his crew was down or scattered, and the forest echoed with the groans of men who had underestimated the wrong land, the wrong family, the wrong soldier. He fired blindly into the dark, furious and frustrated. "Come out and face me, coward." Isaiah's voice cut through the trees, calm and sharp. "You walked into a fight you can't win, Graves. Just like before." "You think you can scare me?" Graves yelled, spinning. "You think hiding in the woods makes you a hero?" "I'm not hiding," Isaiah said, now behind him. "I'm hunting." Graves whipped around, but too late. Isaiah struck with a brutal forearm to the side of the head, knocking him off balance. The two men crashed into the mud, trading punches, raw, close, personal. Graves fought like a man with nothing left, wild and dirty, landing a hard elbow to Isaiah's temple. Isaiah staggered but recovered, slamming Graves down and locking his knee across his chest. "I should finish this right here," Isaiah growled, breath sharp. "For my parents. For every life you've ruined." But then came the sound of sirens in the distance, Sheriff Grayson's signal. Backup, finally coming. Flashlights began to pierce through the forest as deputies moved in. Isaiah stood, leaving Graves coughing in the mud. "You're not worth the bullet." Doc emerged nearby, bruised and muddy, but standing strong. "Looks like the town heard the noise." Isaiah nodded. "Good. Let them see him like this. Let them see what's really running this town." As the deputies cuffed Graves and loaded his bleeding men into the backs of trucks, the townspeople began to gather along the edge of the property, drawn by the commotion, the smoke, the fire. They saw the damage to the barn, the blood in the fields, but more importantly, they saw who had fought back and won. Loretta stood in her doorway, watching it all with quiet defiance, arms folded, eyes locked on the trail of red and blue lights winding down the road. Graves, head down and bleeding, was shoved into the back of a cruiser. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. The dawn after the ambush was gray and bitter, the kind of sky that refused to warm. Smoke from the scorched shed still hung low over the Freeman fields, mixing with the morning fog as Isaiah sat in the barn's back office, staring at lines of data on his laptop screen. His knuckles were scraped raw, and his temples throbbed from the fight the night before. But none of it compared to the tight coil forming in his chest now. He had spent most of the night cross-referencing data from Delgado's encrypted network with regional law enforcement archives, records Grayson had once claimed were lost, sealed, or simply didn't exist. But Isaiah wasn't using a normal login. He had patched through a backdoor still buried in the state's internal system, something he and Doc had used on overseas black site recoveries. What he found chilled him. There, buried beneath years of tampered logs and doctored crash reports, was an internal memo dated 2 weeks before his parents' deaths. Subject: Samuel Freeman. Surveillance initiated. Recommend coercive asset involvement. The memo had been signed by a local official under pressure from a regional enforcement liaison, and that liaison was listed as Sheriff H. Grayson. Isaiah leaned back in his chair, fists clenching at his sides. Every muscle in his body stiffened as the name blinked back at him from the screen. Grayson, the man who had claimed to be tired of corruption, the man who helped them set traps, the man who had shown up with backup after the farm ambush. Isaiah had let him in. Trusted him. Believed he was part of the solution, but he had been part of it from the very beginning. Doc stepped into the barn, wiping his hands with a rag. Got the south perimeter reset. That trip line held better than I thought. What's wrong? Isaiah turned the screen toward him. Doc leaned over, reading, then went still. No, he said flatly. Grayson? Isaiah nodded once, jaw tight. He didn't just look the other way. He signed the order. He was the contact coordinating pressure against my dad. He buried the investigation afterward. Doc blinked slowly. He said he couldn't get anyone to listen. Said he lost people trying to push back. He lied. Isaiah said coldly. He's been lying for decades. Isaiah didn't wait. He found Grayson standing near his patrol car on the edge of the property line, speaking with one of his deputies about hauling off the last of Graves's gear. The sheriff looked tired, mud still on his boots from the swamp, his badge dulled by soot. Isaiah walked straight up and tossed a printed copy of the memo onto the hood of the cruiser. Grayson glanced down at it, then back at Isaiah. His face didn't flinch, but his eyes told the truth. You knew, Isaiah said. You were in on it. You helped cover up their deaths. Grayson swallowed slowly. It wasn't supposed to go that far. Isaiah stepped in closer, fury rippling beneath his voice. They trusted you. I trusted you. All this time, you played both sides. I was young, Grayson said. Just made deputy. I was told to monitor your father, told he was causing unrest, refusing offers, that he was linked to activists the state considered a threat. You killed him for owning land, Isaiah growled. I didn't kill him, Grayson snapped. But I helped silence the fallout. I signed the reports, looked the other way. I did what I was told. By who? Isaiah demanded. Grayson hesitated, then glanced toward town. Landry didn't start this. He's just the latest steward. Orders came from Baton Rouge, State Business Council, real estate trusts tied to oil and rail. They saw your family as an obstacle. Isaiah's voice hardened. So you became the obstacle instead. Grayson's shoulders sagged. I was a coward, and by the time I saw what they really were, it was too late. I stayed in the role because I thought I could undo it from the inside, keep it from getting worse. Isaiah stared at him for a long moment, the weight of betrayal sitting like lead in his chest. You don't get to clean your conscience on my soil, he said. You want to help now? Fine, but don't ever think I forgive you. Grayson nodded slowly. I won't ask you to. Isaiah turned and walked away, the printed memo still fluttering in the breeze behind him. Doc waited by the barn, eyes unreadable. Well, he asked. Isaiah exhaled sharply. He admits it. Says it was bigger than him, that it still is. Doc looked toward town. Then we make it smaller. Isaiah nodded. We burn the rest down. No more lies, no more layers. The betrayal cut deep, but it sharpened his focus. The rot ran wider than he imagined. But now he had names, proof, and clarity. The cartel wanted silence, but Isaiah had found his voice, and they were going to hear it. The wind was sharp that afternoon, rattling the windows of the tool shed where Isaiah sat alone, his elbows resting on the edge of Loretta's old writing desk. The light filtering in through the high window fell across a series of newly decrypted files laid out in front of him. Documents that had taken days to sort through, buried under layers of cartel proxies, fake real estate trusts, and political donation trails. But now they told a story. And it wasn't the one he expected. One file had no digital tag, just a scanned image of an old letter. dated September 1988. It bore the Freeman name, but it wasn't Samuel's handwriting. It was Loretta's. Isaiah's eyes moved slowly over the page, disbelief growing with every word. It was a written agreement, disguised as a land use accommodation, between Loretta Freeman and a political consultant out of Baton Rouge. The language was vague on the surface, full of euphemisms about infrastructure cooperation and temporary access rights. But the metadata trail Doc had unearthed linked the signer of that agreement directly to the Delgado Shell Trust. Isaiah didn't move. The woman who had raised him with iron strength and unwavering defiance had once let the devil in the door. Doc entered quietly, a wrench still in his hand from working on the fence relay. "Zay, I replaced the—" Isaiah didn't turn. "She made a deal." Doc stopped. "What?" Isaiah tapped the letter. "Loretta, 35 years ago, signed over temporary land rights to a dummy firm that turned out to be the Delgado Group. She didn't know what they were at the time, but it was the opening they needed. That was the seed. Everything that followed, Landry, the pipeline interest, my parents' pressure, it started here." Doc approached slowly. "Are you sure?" Isaiah's voice was quiet, but hollow. "She tried to protect the land. Thought she was outmaneuvering a crooked official, but she gave them access. And once they were in, they never left." Doc rubbed the back of his neck. "Damn." Isaiah stood, the paper still in his hand. "All this time, I thought we were standing on something clean. I thought this was about defending our legacy. But the truth is, we're fighting to preserve something that was compromised from the beginning." "You think she knew what it would become?" Isaiah shook his head slowly. "No, but it doesn't matter. That one signature gave them the route they needed. My father refused to renew it. That's when the pressure started. That's why they were killed." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Later that evening, Isaiah walked out to the porch where Loretta sat, shelling peas like she did when he was a boy. The sun was setting behind her, turning the sky a burnt orange, long shadows stretching over the earth. He stood in silence for a long moment. "I found the letter," he said finally. "She didn't stop shelling. I figured you might. You made a deal." She nodded once. "I did." "Why?" Loretta looked up at him, eyes glassy but firm. "Because they were gonna take it anyway." Isaiah's brow furrowed. "You didn't think to tell my father?" "I did," she said. "He was furious. Said I gave the devil a foothold, and maybe I did. But I was tired, Isaiah. I had 2 sons, a sick husband, and men coming to our door every week with briefcases full of paper and quiet threats in their voices." Isaiah's voice cracked. "You thought giving them a sliver would satisfy them?" "I thought I could buy us time," she said. "I thought I was being smart, strategic, but I underestimated what they were. I didn't know Delgado. Not then. I thought it was a state project, some infrastructure hustle. They promised it would never touch the house, the fields, our name." She paused. "Your father never forgave me. He tried to undo it, and they punished him for that. I've lived with that every day since." Isaiah turned away, jaw clenched. "So, I've been fighting to save a legacy built on a deal with murderers." Loretta's voice stayed low. "You've been fighting to stop them from finishing what I helped start. There's a difference." Isaiah didn't answer. She looked down at the bowl in her lap. "There ain't a family in this country that got through clean, Isaiah. Not one. We survive. We compromise. We pay. And sometimes the cost follows us into the next generation." "I don't know what to believe anymore," Isaiah said. "Every part of this feels poisoned." Loretta stood slowly, walked to the porch railing, and laid her hand on his shoulder. "You believe in what you're doing now. You believe in fighting for the people still here. That's the legacy worth saving. Not the papers, not the landlines, the people. The truth." He nodded, but the weight in his chest didn't ease. He walked out into the yard alone, the wind rising as dusk fell around him. What once felt like sacred ground now felt uncertain, still worth defending, but for reasons that no longer fit the story he had always been told. And somewhere deep inside, he wondered if the war he was fighting was even his to finish. But he wasn't done yet. He couldn't be, not until every secret was out, not until every mask was torn off. The night came down hard, heavy with the smell of smoke and wet earth. The fields were silent now, the chaos of the attack behind them, but a different kind of storm still churned deep inside Isaiah. The truth had sunk in, slow and steady like cold water filling his chest, drowning everything he thought he understood. Loretta's letter, the deal, the slow bleed of power from one generation to the next. And through it all, his career, his convictions, the fire that pushed him through wars and grief, none of it had been clean. It was built on a foundation cracked from the start, shaped by a lie no one ever intended to tell out loud. He sat alone in the barn, shoulders slumped forward, elbows resting on his knees, staring into the dim light of the oil lantern swaying from the rafters. Every breath felt heavier now. He thought of his father's hands, worn and strong, guiding his grip around the handle of a shovel. He thought of his mother humming in the kitchen as she peeled sweet potatoes in the same rhythm each night. They had died believing they were fighting for something pure. But even they had been deceived. Even he had. The barn door creaked softly. Isaiah didn't look up. He knew it was her. Loretta stepped inside, slowly, her footsteps quiet against the floorboards. She was wrapped in her shawl, but she looked older tonight. Thinner, like the weight of what she carried had finally begun to show in her bones. She didn't speak at first, just stood near the crates, watching him. "I thought I was doing right," she said gently. Isaiah didn't move. His voice, when it came, was low and tired. "You were the one who taught me to never deal with snakes. I know. You said we don't let them buy us, no matter how nice the offer." She nodded. "I said that too late." Isaiah finally looked at her, eyes hollow. "Why didn't you just tell the truth?" "I was afraid of what it would do to you," she said, stepping forward. "I watched your father try to shoulder everything on his own, watched it tear him apart. And when they came for him, I truly thought, if I just held it all inside, it would die with me." She stopped a few feet from him, her hands trembling, but it didn't. It festered. It poisoned everything. And now here you are, standing in the middle of a war I helped light a match for. Isaiah looked away, jaw tightening. "You don't have to forgive me," she whispered, "but you deserve to know everything." She reached into her coat and unfolded a second letter. "After your parents died, Landry came to me himself. He said it was a shame what happened. Said he could make sure nothing like that ever happened again if I just cooperated quietly going forward. No more resistance. No more headlines." She held the paper out. "I told him no," she said. "That time I said no. But it was too late. He already had what he needed from me years before. And he reminded me of that every single year, every election, every harvest." Isaiah took the paper, but didn't read it. His voice was barely a whisper. "You lived with that all this time?" Loretta's eyes brimmed, but she didn't let the tears fall. "Every day, every time I walked this land, every time I looked at you, I watched you grow strong because of what happened. You wanted to fight for something good. You became a warrior because the world tried to take everything from you. I just never had the heart to tell you it was me who opened the door in the first place." The silence that followed stretched long and cold. Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling the cane fields beyond the fence line. Isaiah finally stood, tall and still, his face unreadable. "I went to war thinking I was avenging something sacred," he said. "Every mission, every fight. I kept telling myself I was carrying my father's name, protecting the bloodline. I built my whole life on a lie." "No," Loretta said firmly, stepping closer. "You built your life on truth. The truth of who you are, of what this land means, of why it matters. The lie was mine, not yours. But everything you became, that came from you. Isaiah's breath caught. His chest heaved once, and for a moment he looked like a boy again. Tired, confused, furious, and wounded. I needed you to be clean, he said. I needed at least one thing in this fight, to be pure. I'm not pure, she said. I'm just a woman who tried to save what she loved, and failed in ways I couldn't see till it was too late. She reached for his hand. He let her. But I never stopped loving you, she said. Never stopped praying that you'd come back, that maybe, by standing your ground, you'd do what I couldn't, finish what your father tried to begin. Isaiah looked down at their hands, calloused against wrinkled, the weight of generations pressed into that one touch. He could have pulled away. He didn't. He let the silence sit between them a while longer, letting the grief and shame and disappointment rise like a tide, and then pass. What had been broken couldn't be undone. But maybe, just maybe, it could still be repaired. I forgive you, he said softly. Loretta inhaled sharply, lips parting. Isaiah held her gaze. Not because I understand it, not because it's easy, but because I have to. If I carry this anger into the fight ahead, it'll eat me alive. He stepped back, squared his shoulders. You did what you thought would protect the family. So did Dad. So did Mom. And now it's my turn. Loretta nodded slowly, her voice hoarse. And you're doing it right. Isaiah turned to the door, but paused. No more secrets. From here on out, we fight together. Loretta wiped her eyes and gave a small smile. Together. That night, under a darkening sky that bled softly into shades of ash and violet, Isaiah stood at the edge of the Freeman field. His boots pressed into the damp earth that had been fought for, bled on, and finally reclaimed. Not by conquest, but by community. The smell of turned soil mixed with burnt wood drifted faintly through the breeze, and across the property, warm halos of newly mounted floodlights began to cast their glow over the fence lines, each bulb humming faintly like a promise against the darkness. The land, once stalked by fear and silence, was no longer quiet, but alive with the low murmur of people working. Not hired hands, not strangers, but neighbors who had finally decided that enough was enough. Doc moved steadily near the southern fence, his shirt damp with sweat, and his sleeves rolled up past the elbows as he worked beside two young men from town, their hands blistered and dirty, but moving with clear purpose as they laid fresh sensor lines across the softened earth. Further up the trail, a pair of old-timers from the church carried scrap beams salvaged from the half-collapsed shed, their laughter rising briefly through the cool air as they shared some half-remembered story about cottonmouths and stubborn mules from a time long gone. The sight struck Isaiah not with sentiment, but with something quieter, something rooted deeper than relief. It wasn't just rebuilding, it was reclaiming. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, the land felt steady beneath his feet. Not because it had been secured, but because the people on it had chosen to stay. The crunch of gravel behind him broke his reflection. Isaiah didn't turn immediately. He knew the gate. Sheriff Grayson approached slowly, his hat in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other, his uniform dusty from travel, his boots coated in red clay. There was no ceremony in his steps, no swagger, just a quiet weight behind the movement of a man who had seen too much and said too little for far too long. Grayson stopped a few feet away, clearing his throat once, and extended the envelope without lifting his eyes. "I've been holding on to this longer than I should have," he said. "Didn't know how to look you in the face after what came to light, but you were right to keep pressing." Isaiah took the envelope, the thick paper cool in his fingers, and studied it before tucking it beneath his arm. He didn't say anything, Not yet. There was still too much inside him to be spoken casually. Grayson nodded, as if he understood. It's everything I could gather without drawing attention to myself. Bank records, property transfers, shadow account numbers, campaign donors. All of them traced to Delgado through proxies and shell groups. Names you'll recognize, and a few you won't. But they all tie back to this town. It's all in there. Isaiah finally met his eyes, searching for something behind the older man's weathered expression. Why now? Grayson exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging a little. Because I'm tired of being a coward. Because watching you fight with no armor but truth made me realize I've been wearing a badge without honor for too damn long. And maybe this won't fix what I did back then, but it's a start. Isaiah didn't offer forgiveness. Not in words, not yet. But he didn't refuse the file either. And that was enough for now. As Grayson turned to walk back toward his cruiser, Isaiah made his way across the field, past the men repairing the eastern gate and the women organizing supplies by the barn. Every face he passed nodded in silent recognition. Not as a soldier, not even as Loretta Freeman's grandson, but as a man who had chosen to stay and see this fight through to its bitter, righteous end. Inside the barn, the air was warm with the scent of pine and metal, the kind of blend that reminded Isaiah of simpler days repairing tractors beside his father, back when the world still made sense in pieces and bolts. He spread the contents of the envelope across the workbench beneath the overhead lamp. The documents were dense, some in legal jargon, others in plain language, but together they painted a clear picture. Delgado hadn't just infiltrated the town, they had embedded themselves into the infrastructure of the state. The same companies pressuring Loretta decades ago now sat on advisory boards, controlled logistics routes, funded politicians, and bought silence by the acre. Every highlighted name was a betrayal. Every signature was a scar. But for the first time, Isaiah didn't feel overwhelmed by the scope of it. He felt prepared. The story wasn't just about land anymore. It was about legacy, what his family had endured, what his father had tried to fight quietly, and what Isaiah now carried forward with clarity. The files were the weapon now, not his fists, not his rank, not the decades of tactical training he had gathered across continents. These papers, cold, irrefutable truth, had the power to collapse an empire if delivered to the right hands. He thought back to that long conversation with Loretta, her voice trembling with guilt, her eyes never breaking from his as she finally admitted the part she played. Her mistake had set things in motion. His parents' defiance had cost them their lives, and his own life, his entire career, had been shaped not by some noble call to arms, but by pain, by a wound carved deep into the earth that no one had ever bothered to close. And yet, in the face of that revelation, he hadn't walked away. He had chosen to stay. Because the legacy wasn't a perfect past. It was the fight for a better future. Not a sanitized version of history, but a reclaimed one. Honest, messy, painful, and still worth holding on to. It was courage passed through generations, not in perfection, but in resilience. His father's quiet strength, his mother's unshaken resolve, his grandmother's stubborn will. They had all carried the weight so that one day someone could finally put it down. Isaiah looked out the barn window toward the house, where Loretta sat on the porch, the soft glow of the overhead lamp painting her silhouette in gold. She wasn't waiting for him to forgive her anymore. She wasn't asking to be cleared. She had told the truth and stood her ground. And now, so would he. Isaiah gathered the files, bundled them into a single folder, and slid it into the satchel near the barn door. There would be calls to make. Journalists, federal contacts, military friends who still owed him favors. This time, he wasn't going to fight them in the shadows. This time, he was going to expose every name in daylight. As he stepped back outside, the wind lifted softly through the cane fields, carrying with it the scent of earth and ash and something else. Renewal. The land would never be the same, but maybe, just maybe, that was the point. The morning sun rose slow and gold over Freeman land, casting long beams across the dew-covered fields and rooftops still blackened at the edges from the last assault. But something in the air had shifted. No longer just the weight of survival or resistance, but a tension on the edge of release. The kind that comes before the fall of something long protected by fear. Inside the barn, Isaiah fastened the final clasp on his satchel. The thick folder containing Delgado's network, bank trails, forged contracts, and names that had ruled their county from behind polished doors. He was no longer planning defense. He was executing justice. Doc stepped in, freshly shaven, his fatigue jacket buttoned neat to the collar. He scanned the room, then locked eyes with Isaiah. "You sure about doing this out in the open?" Isaiah gave a small nod. "That's the point. No shadows, no secrets. Not anymore." Doc's lips tightened into something between a smirk and a grimace. "Then let's make it loud." By noon, a crowd had gathered near the town courthouse. Not by summons, not by mandate, but through a string of quiet calls and word of mouth that spread like fire across Sunday breakfast tables. Farmers, business owners, teachers, churchgoers, all of them drawn by something they hadn't seen in a long time. Accountability on the horizon. Grayson stood on the steps in full uniform, flanked by two deputies who weren't bought, weren't buried, and weren't afraid to follow a sheriff who had finally stepped out from under his own mistakes. At exactly 12:15 p.m., Isaiah stepped forward onto the courthouse steps. He carried no weapons. He wore no armor. Just truth. Graves had already been hauled off days ago, still bruised and silent after the failed ambush. His men, what was left of them, were scattered, hiding or in custody, some already flipping under the weight of what they had seen in those woods. But Isaiah wasn't here for the foot soldiers. He was here for the man still smiling at ribbon cuttings and charity luncheons. The man who sat in the mayor's office behind polished wood, acting as if none of the blood ever touched his hands. Mayor Eli Landry. The courthouse doors opened. Landry stepped out as if summoned, in his usual dark blazer and soft southern grin. For a moment, he looked amused, until he saw the folder in Isaiah's hands, until he realized the crowd wasn't here to honor him. Isaiah raised his voice, not with volume, but with clarity. "For years," he began, "this town has been strangled by the illusion of stability, by men who said they were protecting our values while lining their pockets with blood money and laundering corruption through deeds and silence." He opened the folder and held it up. "These are the documents linking Mayor Landry to cartel-backed shell groups, to Delgado, to every deal and infrastructure project that was meant to bleed this land dry, while we were too afraid or too tired to fight back." Gasps moved through the crowd like wind through leaves. Landry stepped forward, chuckling nervously. "Now, hold on. These are baseless accusations from a man with a personal grudge." Sheriff Grayson stepped beside Isaiah and raised his hand. "These documents have already been submitted to the State Attorney General's office, the FBI, and 3 federal journalists. Bank accounts are frozen as of this morning. Warrants are being prepared as we speak." The crowd was silent now, watching, waiting. Isaiah stepped closer to Landry, his voice steady. "You killed my parents with a pen, not directly, but you set the chain in motion. You leveraged fear, paid for silence, and tried to erase a family because we wouldn't bow. And now, the town that watched quietly is watching you." Landry's mask cracked. He turned to Grayson. "You think this absolves you? You helped me cover half of this, and I'll stand trial if I have to," Grayson interrupted. But I'm not hiding anymore. The mayor looked at the crowd, his smile gone, his voice rising. You all really going to believe this? This man came back with a soldier's rage and a vendetta. This is vigilante garbage, but no one spoke for him. No one stepped forward, because no one believed him anymore. Loretta arrived late, walking slow but upright, flanked by two of the oldest neighbors on either side. Her eyes met Landry's for a moment, and he looked away first. Grayson stepped forward and read the charges aloud. Abuse of public office, conspiracy, obstruction, laundering, and racketeering. One by one. Each word a nail in a coffin that had waited decades to close. And when the deputies moved, Landry didn't fight. He didn't shout. He just went quiet, swallowed by the silence of a town that had finally found its voice. That evening, as the sun set behind the line of trees bordering Freeman land, the people of Whitefield gathered once more, this time not for defense, but for celebration. Children ran between long tables strung with lights. Elderly neighbors passed plates of food made from the very soil that had been defended. Old grudges seemed to soften as strangers shook hands and shared stories they once kept quiet. Isaiah stood near the porch where Loretta sat, wrapped in her shawl, a soft smile warming her face. He turned as Grayson approached, not in uniform this time, just a man with lines on his face and peace in his eyes. You sticking around? Isaiah asked. Grayson nodded. If you'll have me. Isaiah didn't hesitate. So long as you keep speaking the truth. Doc stepped up beside them, watching the laughter spill across the yard. You ever think we'd get to this part? Isaiah shook his head slowly. Not like this. Not altogether. He looked out over the land. Not just fields and fences, but history reclaimed. We're not the same town we were, he said. We're not going back. Loretta raised her glass. And we're not hiding anymore. In that moment, as the stars began to pierce the sky and the sound of voices carried into the night, there was no need for walls, for weapons, for warnings. The battle had been won, not by force alone, but by truth, by unity, and by the power of a community that refused to be divided any longer. The Freeman land stood quiet again, but this time it was not silence. It was peace. The moon hung high over the delta, casting cold light across the swampland where the final remnants of corruption hid like wounded animals. The cartel compound, a fortified sugarcane processing plant retrofitted into a makeshift smuggling base, sat tucked behind tall fences and brush, guarded by motion sensors, rotating spotlights, and men with blood on their hands. They thought no one would come this far. They thought the town had already laid down its arms. They didn't count on Isaiah Freeman. From a ridge beyond the tree line, Isaiah crouched in the shadows with Doc and 4 others, former SEALs, friends who owed him not favors, but loyalty carved from combat. Each one was dressed in dark tactical gear, faces painted with mud and shadow, hearts steady under pressure. Isaiah checked his watch once, then whispered the sequence through his comm. Windfall 1, ready breach. To his left, Doc rigged the southern fence with a shaped charge, while 2 others moved along the canal to intercept the fuel generator powering the floodlights. The rest flanked west, toward the elevated catwalks that ran over the main warehouse. In 20 seconds, the perimeter would go dark. Inside the compound, cartel guards lounged with false confidence, smoking, pacing, checking their gear, unaware that the night was no longer theirs. At exactly 01 Garn, Isaiah gave the nod. The explosion at the south wall was tight and controlled, a sharp concussive thud that rocked the earth but left no flame. Simultaneously, the power grid snapped, plunging the entire site into pitch-black silence. Panic erupted from within, men shouting in Spanish and English, scrambling for weapons, switching on flashlights that only made them easier targets. Isaiah moved first, silent as wind, slicing through the outer fence and slipping into the compound like water through a crack. He darted between cover, crates, metal drums, abandoned forklifts, until he was behind the first two guards near the stairwell. He struck fast. The first never saw him, dragged down with an arm around the throat, body limp before he hit the dirt. The second turned just in time for Isaiah's elbow to meet his jaw, dropping him hard. Footsteps approached fast. Another guard rounded the corner, rifle raised. Isaiah stepped forward, disarming him with a smooth pivot, then drove his knee into the man's chest, followed by a crushing punch to the throat. Nearby, Doc breached the southern warehouse door and met resistance immediately. Two men opened fire from the catwalk above. Sparks danced as bullets pinged off metal walls. Doc ducked behind a pillar, then hurled a flash charge upward. The pop blinded both men long enough for him to move. He climbed fast, hands gripping the steel railing, and met them with unrelenting force. The first was dispatched with a blade to the thigh and a strike across the neck. The second tried to retreat. Doc tackled him clean over the edge, the two of them crashing down in a heap of grunts and dirt. "West corridor clear," Doc muttered into the comm, blood streaking his forearm. Isaiah entered the main hallway next, clearing rooms methodically. He caught one man trying to radio for help, slammed him face first into a filing cabinet, then spun as another lunged with a crowbar. They fought hand to hand, brutal and loud. Isaiah took a hit to the ribs, stumbled back, then retaliated with 3 quick jabs to the stomach, following with a headbutt that ended the struggle. The man dropped, unconscious. Alarms blared now. From the upper deck, a cartel enforcer emerged, massive, tattooed, eyes wild with adrenaline. He carried a tactical shotgun and wore Kevlar across his chest. Isaiah climbed toward him, dodging a blast that splintered the railing just inches from his side. At the top, they collided, steel against bone, rage against precision. The man swung with fury, but Isaiah moved with purpose. They traded blows, 1 to the chin, 2 to the ribs, then a grapple. Isaiah was lifted and slammed into the wall, pain blooming down his spine, but he used the momentum to twist the man off balance, driving his shoulder into his opponent's center mass. The gun fell. Isaiah recovered first, grabbed a pipe, and swung it hard across the back of the man's knees. The enforcer roared, collapsed, then tried to stand again, only for Isaiah to drop him with a clean, thunderous punch to the temple. Outside, gunfire cracked across the canal, where the backup team engaged fleeing gang members. One tried to escape on a dirt bike, was intercepted by a tripwire, and sent tumbling into a ditch. Another attempted to hide beneath an overturned supply truck. He didn't see Doc step in behind him, silent as a shadow, and deliver a knee to the base of his skull that ended the encounter clean. Within 12 minutes, it was done. Isaiah swept the last hallway, clearing the communication room. There, he found the final piece. Hard drives, burner phones, cache pallets, all proof of the operation's scale. The room stank of desperation and secrecy. He snapped photos, copied drive data, then set a timed charge on the server hub. He stood for a moment before exiting, eyes tracing the cartel's map still pinned to the wall. Routes, payoffs, coded names. This was the heart of it. And now, it would be ash. Minutes later, the compound burned, contained, controlled, but final. No more hiding spots, no more safe houses, no more silence. Just flames licking the sky as Isaiah and his team moved back through the swamp, the fire behind them marking the end of a reign too long endured. By dawn, they stood once more on Freeman land, mud-streaked, sore, but whole. Sheriff Grayson met them at the gate, eyes wide with the scale of what had just been dismantled. "Is it done?" he asked quietly. Isaiah nodded. There's nothing left to hide behind. The network's burned, the chain's broken. Grayson looked out toward the road. Then I'll see to it that the pieces never come back. As sunlight broke over the treetops, casting gold across the farmhouse and fields, Isaiah removed his gloves and looked out over the land. There was blood in the soil, yes, pain in its past, but now there was also freedom. The sun had barely cleared the tree line when the first federal convoy arrived. Unmarked black SUVs flanked by a pair of government sedans, followed closely by armored vans bearing the seal of the Department of Justice. Dust kicked up along the gravel roads as the vehicles rolled to a stop near the old mill site. Now nothing more than ash and smoldering steel bones. The local news vans weren't far behind, their antennas rising like silver stalks in a new kind of field. For the first time in decades, Whitefield wasn't being ignored. Inside the courthouse, federal agents began cataloging evidence. Binders, hard drives, burner phones, and photographs recovered from Isaiah's team during the raid. Sheriff Grayson oversaw the handoff. No longer the conflicted man clinging to shadows, but a lawman finally stepping into the light, guiding the investigators through the chain of corruption he had once helped conceal. His confession had already been submitted, signed, detailed, unflinching, and it had done what none of them expected. It had sparked a flood. Dozens of small-town officials across the state were now being investigated under a widening net of subpoenas and sealed indictments. Properties tied to Delgado fronts were seized in Baton Rouge, Lafayette, and the outskirts of New Orleans. A sitting state senator quietly resigned under mounting pressure. Behind closed doors, the Delgado group itself fractured, its upper command vanishing into private flights and locked accounts, too fast for most, but not all. Those left behind, accountants, enforcers, smugglers, were arrested in waves, pulled from mansions and motel rooms alike, their names logged, their assets frozen, their silence no longer bought. And at the center of it all was a stack of documents stamped Freeman Evidence File. Mayor Eli Landry, already removed from office, sat behind reinforced glass in a federal detention center 3 counties north, awaiting trial under RICO charges. His public defenders had made noise about political persecution, but the weight of the evidence was too overwhelming, too clean, too detailed. Wire transfers, recorded calls, signed contracts, all tracing back to the moment he helped orchestrate the death of Samuel and Patrice Freeman. He refused to speak Isaiah's name. Even now, stripped of power and title, he still clung to his delusion of control. But control was gone. Wyatt Graves sat in a separate facility, cut off from his contacts, disavowed by Delgado, reduced to a name on a docket no one would defend. He tried to cut a deal early on, offering up supply chains, regional handlers, backdoor communication methods, but what little he knew had already been burned in Isaiah's raid. His information was stale, his leverage gone, and so he sat. Conviction was a formality. Back in Whitefield, the cleanup began not with machines, but with people. Community meetings shifted from whispered rumors to open plans. The local farmers' cooperative, once manipulated by cartel-backed brokers, reclaimed their voting rights and installed new leadership. The high school, once underfunded and overlooked, received a wave of anonymous donations traced back to veteran groups Isaiah had quietly contacted. A new mural began on the side of the old grain elevator, one of Samuel and Patrice Freeman, arms locked, the fields behind them gold and eternal. Loretta watched it unfold from her porch most mornings, a mug of chicory coffee in hand, the quiet hum of tractors in the distance blending with the sound of hammering and children's laughter. The town wasn't healed, not completely, but it was no longer silent, no longer afraid. She and Isaiah didn't speak much of the raid. They didn't have to. It was written in the dirt, in the restored fences, in the way people nodded when they passed, not out of fear or obligation, but respect. Doc remained for a few more weeks, helping coordinate local security, then returned home to his family with a firm handshake and an unspoken promise. He'd be back if needed. Sheriff Grayson stayed. He made no speeches, just worked, rebuilding trust brick by brick, attending town halls, admitting to what he'd done, answering hard questions without hiding behind a badge. Some forgave, some didn't, but none could deny he was doing the work. As for Isaiah, he returned to the fields, not to escape, but to anchor himself. He walked the rows his father once walked, hands brushing over cane and cotton. The weight of legacy finally balanced between pain and peace. He didn't run from what had happened. He carried it. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the wind rustled the trees just right, he knelt beside the small stone markers beneath the sycamore tree, the resting place of Samuel and Patrice. He said nothing, just sat with them a while, the quiet between them full of memory and meaning. When he rose, he turned toward the farmhouse, where Loretta stood at the top of the steps, waiting. And together, they went inside, because the storm had passed. And now, it was time to rebuild. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.